Hey folks, welcome back. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you had the age-old question from Halo or TF2 of, are you red or blue, and applied that to a World of Warcraft class? Well, in today's video, we're going to cover a class that has done just that, with Dragonflight on the horizon and the creation of the Dracthea Evoker. We now have a class where, when we get to the town section, you do get to choose very much, are you red side or blue side? So without any further delay, let's get into it. Originally in this video I was going to do a full breakdown of spells with spell animations and things like that, but due to how early we are in the alpha, I thought to condense this down, and we're going to look at both the class tree and the actual devastation talent tree, because the devastation tree itself is the ranged DPS focus. And I think that going through this is probably going to be much better overall, because it gives us a better understanding, and I can talk you through my thoughts and feelings of the spec rather than necessarily just quoting other people that obviously have had the opportunity to play the alpha to date. So without any further delay, let's get into the Evoker tree, and then we'll look at the Devastation tree itself afterwards and answer that good old question of, are you red or are you blue? So, starting with the Evoker tree itself. Baselined by picking the Devastation spec, we get an ability called Landslide, which is a 90-second cooldown, conjures a path of shifting stone towards the targeted location, rooting enemies for 30 seconds, and damage may cancel the effect. Following that, you then have Natural Convergence, where Disintegrate channels 20% faster. Now, Disintegrate is one of your primary essence spenders. Evokers have two resources. They have one called Essence, and the other is Mana. Now, Mana, obviously, as any caster or healer knows, doesn't really need much management, just make sure it never hits 0. Essence, on the other hand, is a bit aesthetically, it looks a lot like Chi, but it operates in the same way as energy, and then it regenerates over time. So you can't build Essence, but the baseline charge rate for Essence is 1 every 5 seconds. Now, there are elements within the talent tree that alter that, so they can regenerate faster, or you can have more of them, and your Essence spenders, as a result, have almost an internal cooldown that isn't specified as being a cooldown, but if you have to spend 3 essences on an ability, then it's going to take you at most 15 seconds before you can cast that ability for a second time, because you obviously need to regenerate the resources. So that is something to bear in mind going forward, and Disintegrate is one of the blue spells that we were discussing that further get augmented within the red versus blue tree, which is the Devastation's main tree itself, which we'll discuss once we've covered the classes. Now, you have a few options following the Natural Convergence. One thing to note, actually, is generally speaking, this side will be your DPS, this far left, your DPS abilities and utility. The middle is generally defensives, group-wide buffs, or utility to just help the group. And this far right-hand side is your healing elements. So if you're playing Devastation, you're likely to spend quite a lot of points here to the left and some to the middle, with some intermingling probably in these lower elements here within the Preservation side. And alternatively, if you're a Preservation Evoker, you'll find that a lot of your points go to this right-hand side, and then you're kind of transitioning over to the left as you go through it. So, Obsidian Scales is pretty much going to be taken. It is a defensive, 2.5 minute cooldown, but you can reduce it by taking Obsidian Bulwark. Now, Permeating Chill is an interesting ability because your damaging blue spells reduce the target's movement speed by 50% for 3 seconds, which kind of turns you a little bit into a Frost Mage, because one of the filler spells that Evoker have, called Azure Strike, cleaves to targets, but there is a talent here that allows you to cleave onto a 3rd target, which means that because it's instant cast, you can keep this 50-second snare up for 3 seconds permanently on these small groups of targets. So we'll assume that you're probably going to want to play around with that, maybe, because you're going to want Obsidian Bulwark to lower the cooldown for that. And even then, having a 50-second snare for 3 seconds just by casting Azure Strike every few seconds, like if a tank needs to kite, is pretty good. Now, this is where things get interesting, because here, which is one of the things that you will definitely be grabbing regardless, is Quell, which is our kick. However, it's a 40-second kick. Interrupt the enemy spellcasting, preventing any spell from that skull being cast for 4 seconds. It's your counter spell. It's on par with flipping Demonology Warlocks in terms of kick. So it's a really long kick. However, there is a talent here, Imposing Presence, that reduces it down to a 20-second cooldown, which makes it shorter than most other range kicks. Doesn't quite compete with melee, but it's still quite a quick kick. So you'll probably take that. Now, you can see here that you need 8 points required before we can go down to the next section. And at the moment, we've only spent 5. Now, we have a couple of options here. You can pick something like Expunge, which is your removing poison effects. So it's a poison dispel. Classes such as Ret Paladin have access to it as a utility spell, so you could take it. Or you also have abilities like Forager of the Mountains, where Landslide's cooldown is reduced by 30 seconds and can withstand 200% more damage before breaking. This is kind of a utility ability for Landslide. Again, might be good during certain weeks. Or you have abilities or spells such as Innate Magic, which causes your essence to regenerate 5% faster. Now, at 2 ranks, that is going to be, I assume, because the tooltip unfortunately doesn't change, 10% faster. If it's 10% faster, then rather than generating one every 5 seconds, you're probably going to be generating one every 4.5 or close to 4 seconds. We'll have to obviously see with final tuning. But you can see that in doing that, it brings us to 7 out of the 8 required before we can transition, at which point we have another selectioning open up. We can either choose the utility from Clobbering Sweep, which Tail Swipe's cooldown is reduced by 45 seconds. Tail Swipe is very much like a Monk's Leg Sweep. The only difference is, rather than it being a stun, you actually end up throwing your targets into the air. It fundamentally amounts to the same thing, I believe, in that it is a form of CC, but whether it works as an actual CC, or if the throwing up effect of Tail Sweep acts the same as the Arcane Mage's Supernova, I think it's called, where it throws targets into the air. They can still cast while falling up and down directly because of Z-axis, and technically they're not moving, they're just falling. Or you can have Wing Buffer, which is a knockback, and you can reduce its cooldown by 45 seconds. Alternatively, you can choose the ability Recall. Now, Recall allows you, after casting Deep Breath, to travel back to your location, to where you started. So, if you want to play almost Demon Hunter-esque momentum build, then something like Recall might be quite good. Now, personally, I kind of play around with having a knockback or a shorter knockback, but you're entirely up to you. Now, here is an option that if you're going to be playing the red build, you're probably going to end up picking up, and that is Enkindled, where your Living Flame deals 5% more damage or healing. Now, Living Flame is a rather unique spell in that it is your filler, like Shadow Bolt, Smite, Mind Blast, Wrath. However, it effect changes based on what you're targeting. So if you're targeting an enemy, it will obviously do damage. But if you're targeting a friendly, it will heal. That's why Enkindled here either deals 5% more damage or 5% more healing. So just makes it 5% more effective overall. Now, removing those 2 talents for a second, we'll focus on going further down. Now, here you have Tip the Scales, which compresses time to make your next empowered spell instantly cast at its maximum empower level. Now, empowering is unique to the Evoker. It is basically charging up a spell through stages 1, 2, and 3, baseline, and each stage will increase either how much damage it does, or how much healing, or if it adds another effect to the cast. Tip the Scales as a 2-minute cooldown allows you to instantly get a maximum chargeability out without having to wait for that charge time. So, pretty much a guaranteed pick. You then have Suffused with Power, which increases your magic damage done. You're going to want that as a DPS. Roar of Exhilaration, after successfully interrupting an enemy with Quell, regenerates 1 essence. Now, I suspect this is going to be something that you're going to pick up in Mythic Plus or in a solo setting, because you're likely to get more kicks. In a raid setting, though, obviously depending on the fights, you may not necessarily want to take Roar of Exhilaration. Now, Fire Breath's instant damage is increased by 10%. Unfortunately, if we want to progress any further down through some of these abilities, it's something that we'd have to take. Otherwise, we can't play around with some of these other abilities. So it's a bit rough, but we take it. Now again, we're at 13 points and we need 20, so this gives us a little bit of option to play around with the rest of our toolkit. So we have Draconic Legacy, your stamina is increased by 2%. Magic damage, Tempered Scales, where your magic damage taken is reduced by 2%. Or Hover, which lasts an additional 4 seconds. Now, Hover is a Dracthea equivalent of Spirit Walker's Grace. You hover in the air, you can move around while casting, and it's on a 35-second cooldown. Now, there are a few abilities like Tailwind, where Hover increases your movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds. You can get additional charges of Hover, or Hover lasts an additional 4 seconds, which means that you can be a highly mobile caster. So, let's assume that you're in a situation where you want this extra mobility. So, you want the increased movement speed for 4 seconds after using Hover, and we're going to take Extended Flight to increase the hover duration as well. And we're not too worried about magic damage we're taking, for now at least. And our stamina is fine, because, you know, we're staying out of trouble. We're spending more time at range. We're not getting hit. We don't need to worry too much. Because unlike Warlock, for instance, Dracthea doesn't seem to have elements that scale off how much stamina they have, or how much health they have overall. Devastation Evokers, I'll clarify, because Preservation Evokers do actually have a little bit of interaction with their health based on their mastery. But we still have 2 points before we can further spend into the next rank of abilities. So, assuming that we're doing kind of maybe group content perhaps, or solo content, and we're wanting, you know, the extra mobility, Cauterizing Flame, really, really strong. It is a healing focused ability, I guess, because it is a dispel on a 1-minute cooldown, but you cauterize your allies' wounds, removing all bleed, poison, curse, and disease effects, healing for 350% of spell power upon removing any effect. Now, this is really strong because this is going to interact and almost act like a stone form for a group. And this is a huge amount of utility to have on a DPS as a strong cleanse. Because taking these two talents would enable, Expunge and Cauterizing Flame, would enable you to dispel a considerable amount of things from your group in order to help the healer, or even yourself as you're going through things. So we'll take Cauterizing Flame, which opens up a couple of paths here. You can have Attuned to the Dream, which increases the healing done and healing received by 2%, or you can have Sleepwalk, which is a form of CC. Encaps the target for 20 seconds, causing them to sleepwalk towards you. Damage has a chance to awaken them. Interesting, flavorful bit of text, but obviously one of the key things here in terms of what you're CCing and it walking towards you is how that would work in social interact, or whether or not a pack would socially aggro off this. One case I can see it being instantly used for is Inspiring. If Inspiring remains going into the next expansion, using Sleepwalk on an Inspiring mob to force that mob to walk out of the group towards you where you are situated, and then getting further CC'd by a polymorph or something like that is going to be huge, especially when we start talking about another ability that we have access to further down the tree. So we need one more point, and for now we're just going to place it in Roar of Exhilaration. Interrupting an enemy with Quell generates 1 essence. And finally it opens up this line. Now, Oppressing Roar is a 2-minute cooldown ability that lets out a bone-shaking roar at enemies in a cone in front of you, increasing the duration of all crowd control effects on them by 50% in the next 10 seconds. This, on its own, doesn't seem particularly impressive outside of setting up for much longer CC chains. So, Oppressing Roar into a AoE stun, whether it be a leg sweep, a Shadow Fury, Cap Totem, would enable for an additional 50% on top of that, so helping the tank. Now, you can see on the tooltip that it has Overroar on it. Now, Overroar is this talent here. Oppressing Roar removes 1 enrage effect from each enemy, and its cooldown is reduced by 20 seconds for each enrage dispelled. Some weeks, this ability, so Oppressing Roar, is going to be huge. Now, it removes 20 seconds for each enrage dispelled. Now, if you have Raging Weak, or don't have an ability, or don't have a druid in the group, or a rogue that can use Shiv, or a hunter, you may want to be using this, especially when it comes to much larger packs, and everything gets bolstered at the same time, or starts getting very, very angry. Obviously, we don't know all the dungeons yet, so we don't quite know how everything's going to pan out, but it's likely to be a very strong group-wide utility thing. On the other side, you have Protracted Talons. Now, Protracted Talons causes your Azure Strike's damage to damage 1 additional target. Now, Azure Strike's baseline hits 2 targets. It's your other instant cast, or it's an instant cast filler that works alongside your Living Flame in terms of your base spell toolkit. And Protracted Talons increases its ability to cleave, therefore cleaving 3 targets. And because Azure Strike is a blue class spell, your damaging blue spells reduce the target's movement speed by 50% for 3 seconds. This means that you are going from being able to, you can quite consistently spam Azure Strike to snare 3 targets in place at 50% movement speed forever, basically. Every other spell cast, which is huge. And if you're going down the blue tree, is pretty much mandatory in terms of DPS. Unravel is basically your Shattering Throw. It sunder an enemy's protective magic, dealing 500 spell damage, spell frost, to absorb shields. So this is very much your using it on a boss like Hakar that has Blood Shield, for instance, if you were to use it now in Shadowlands. Huge amount of damage, 9-second cooldown. This is going to be a mandatory pick if at any point you end up with a lot of shield casters and things like that. It'd be interesting to see how it does in PvP against things like mages and stuff like that. But from a PvE perspective, you have a couple of utility options either side of Protracted Talons. Following this down then, you have Leaping Flames. Fire Breath causes your next Living Flame to strike 1 additional target per empower level. Now, if you remember, Living Flame either damages or heals based on the target that you pick, but Fire Breath would then allow your next Living Flame to cleave to other targets. This opens up a rather interesting element to utility in that you could Fire Breath a pack if you're DPSing, and then use your cleaving Living Flame to potentially target your allies, say during a Grievous week, to help the healer out. Obviously, we don't know how the interaction is going to work. Is it just going to pick the additional targets that are close to what you initially heal? Can it heal and DPS at the same time, but having the ability to cleave Living Flame as a filler opens up some options for AoE. And as you can probably start seeing through some of these abilities like Fire Breath, Pyre once we discussed that, and obviously Leaping Flames, you end up in a situation where the Fire School seems to be very focused around buffing your AoE and doing group content, essentially. You are just going to be breathing fire and causing havoc everywhere as you go. Moving on to Terror of the Skies, though, it's a talent that applies a stun effect to Deep Breath. Now, remembering that you do have abilities like Oppressive Roar, that then going into having Terror of the Skies, you can then increase that stun even further with some forethought and some planning, which is an interesting combination, really. But assuming you take Oppressing Roar, let's discuss a few of these other talents and moving across. Now, we still have access to a few talent points at this stage, and we've got quite a bit of the toolkit that's available to us already. But you have Aerial Mastery, which enables Hover to gain an additional charge. Remember, Hover is the Spirit Walker's grace, essentially, for Evokers, and with talents like Tailwind and Extended Flight, you can have these incredible bursts of additional movement, and given a second charge, would enable you to get the hell out of dodge, continue while casting. So if there's a lot of movement on a fight like, say, Jailer or Halondrus, where there's a lot of moving around needed to be done, a talent like Aerial Mastery might be really strong. And that leads into Time Spiral, which is a bronze spell and focuses on bending time, allowing you and your allies to cast their major movement ability once in the next 10 seconds, even if it's on cooldown. So this is your Heroic Leaps, your Demonic Circles, anything like that, which might not necessarily be something you take in group content, but can definitely see a lot of use in a raiding setting, and likely is going to be required for one or two Evokers to take. Because when we start talking about the buffs that an Evoker can provide, looking at the class tree still, they have a few rather important ones. So you obviously have Time Spiral, which is a movement ability cooldown, for want of a better term, paired with the raid buff that they provide, which further reduces the cooldown of movement abilities by, I believe it's 15%. But they also have other things like Source of Magic. Now, Source of Magic's an interesting one, because assuming you didn't need Aerial Mastery, and you don't need the Hover, and you decide to reduce the magic damage you take, and pick this up, you can redirect your access magic to a friendly healer for 30 minutes. When you cast an empowered spell, you restore 0.5 of their maximum mana per empower level, which when you consider that you have Tip the Scales, which will just allow you to instantly cast a maximum empower ability, and there are spells within the talent tree or the devastation tree that change your empower max, so that you can have a 4th rank of empower rather than 3, or you can have essence bursts, which allow you to essentially cast an empowered spell for free. You can regenerate a lot of mana for your healer, because that's like 2% or 1.5% every time you then go into casting your empowerment. You then also have ability like Fly With Me, which causes you to swoop to your ally and give them a lift to the target location. Now, this has got a lot of coverage at the moment on YouTube and stuff like that for its meme potential, because if you imagine Life Grip, but you can just kamikaze yourself off a cliff with somebody, yeah, that works. But alternatively, if you have a Warlock that needs to get to a location, or a Paladin or a Death Knight, and they're rather slow, with Fly With Me, you can actually get them there yourself faster. This does allow for elements of looking after your group and making sure that they're okay, would require some very, very fast reflexes, but I suppose if you had like party 1, party 2, party 3 type macros, you could do this pretty quickly. And if you were to take it, it then opens you up with you and your ally are protected from harm, absorbing 30% damage equal to absorbing damage equal to 30% of your maximum health for 5 seconds. And this is where you might want to take something like Draconic Legacy, because then you're providing a shield for your team, the team member you pick up, whether it be the healer or it could even be a tank, I guess, if the tank wanted to be repositioned somewhere once you've stunned everything or rooted them in place with an ability like Landslide. You can position, so a situation I can see you using this, just thinking about it now as we're discussing the talents, is you fly in to the pack, you've stood at range, the tank calls that they need assistance, they've got everything grouped up. You fly in, root everything, and then as you're getting back out of the group, you can fly with the tank, picking him up and leaving the fight space. And with Twin Guardian, that means he's also getting a shield absorb for those couple of seconds where he might be hit in the back before he's out of range. And bearing in mind it's a 1.5 minute cooldown, if you were to take Forger of the Mountains, you can reduce that to a minute cooldown, which ties up perfectly with Fly With Me, and also increases the damage that Landslide can take by 200% before the root effect is broken. Which is a rather powerful combination, especially when you consider that you might take Oppressive Roar, you could use Deep Breath to get in rather than Landslide and stun things, or you can use a mix of these abilities. But if we remove that for a moment and discuss these other abilities. Now, Ancient Flame, healing yourself with Living Flame reduces the cast time of your next Living Flame by 40%. Now, as an ability on its own, that might not sound too impressive. However, in a leveling experience or in a group setting, using it to keep yourself out of, say, Grievous, or if the healer goes down, you can then capitalize on reducing the cooldown of your next Living Flame by 40%. Which, again, if you're going into a situation where, you're quite low, you've taken a lot of damage, you're out of range of the healer, using that on yourself, healing, casting Fire Breath, and then being able to cast a sped up, empowered Living Flame on target or on the group might be something that's beneficial. Obviously, we'll know when we get to properly play with it, but by taking it, you enable yourself to get something called Renewing Blaze. Now, Renewing Blaze is a bit like Alter Time. Flames of Life surround you for 8 seconds, healing you over 14 seconds for 100% of the damage taken. Now, this is essentially, as long as you don't insta-dart or you don't get one shot within these 8 seconds, you can take it, and over 14 seconds you will get all of that health back. So, very much like on Alter Time, and if you take it, you then have the ability to augment it by either reducing its cooldown by 30 seconds, so it becomes a minute cooldown, or while Renewing Blaze initial effect is active, you receive 20% increased healing from all sources. Now, the initial effect is the Flames of Life surrounds you for 8 seconds. So, while it's up and surrounding you, you then get healed by an additional 20%, and then you will then heal for 100% of the damage you took after that. So if you're going to be taking a lot of consistent AoE damage, maybe say Haywire from the drill within the other side in the Mechagon wing, that does a lot of AoE damage. Think of a situation like that. Having Renewing Blaze's initial effect allow you to receive 20% additional healing for those 8 seconds means that you could be kept alive. And then once that 8 seconds expires and it turns over to the 14-second hot, you're then going to be getting a lot of healing through the damage that you took and survived. Obviously, I'm not saying cheese with it. It's an example of how this ability might be used. Alternatively, you have Lush Growth, which your green spells heal for 5%, restore 5% more health. Not something you're really going to be taking as a DPS, but still a rather interesting ability. So we'll take the Fire Within, reduce its cooldown. And then you have finally Zephyr. Now, Zephyr is a 2-minute cooldown that conjures an updraft for your party for lifting within 25 yards, lifting them into the air and reducing the magic damage taken. Or damage taken from area of effect attacks, by 20% and increasing movement speed by 30% for 8 seconds. Again, this is large AoE prevention, a bit like Darkness, whereas Darkness just has a chance to flat dodge the damage that's incoming, making it very, very strong. This just flat reduces the damage taken from AoE effects, so AoE rogues faint, if you will. Just without elusiveness tied to it. But again, it's a movement speed increase. Having a Dracthea in the group with Death Knights and Paladins feels very much like you are the utility child. And one interview that was expanded upon recently, I believe it was with Taliesin, but the Evoker tree itself and the main Dracthea Evoker plays almost like a bard, but it isn't. Now, for those of you that have played other fantasy games, whether it be Final Fantasy XIV or, other games where you have a utility-heavy class that does a little bit of everything, that is kind of the Evoker. We can give mana to our healers. We can help increase the mobility of our team. We can... one of our casted damage fillers can also heal if we throw it out on people. We can cleanse and we can dispel. We can actually have abilities like rescue. So if we remove a pressing roll for a second, pick this up, you have an ability called rescue, which you can fly to an ally and just heal them, and that can be something completely baseline. Which, again, going into a situation where you might want Fly with Me and Twin Guardian, you might decide to landslide through the target or deep breath them, fly to your tank to heal them, and then fly out with them. Obviously, this takes a lot of setup, but the principle here within the toolkit is, as a Dracthea, you have a lot of tools within your kit that you can play around with to enable you to look after the group you're playing with. And it's a very strong utility heavy build. Something to look forward to play with, but not necessarily something I think I would ever consider as an option to main. Now, let's discuss the Devastation tree and actually go into that whole are you red or are you blue discussion that I first mentioned at the start of this video. And moving on to the Devastation tree then. So, to start with, you'd pick up Pyre. Now, Pyre is a 3 essence spender. You lob a ball of fire at the target and feed the flames, which is a augment within the red side. You can then reduce the cooldown of Flame Breath by 3 seconds each time you do it. Now, up the top here, there's a rather interesting mix of abilities. We need 8, and you're likely to take both Essence Bursts. This means that your Living Flame has a 20% chance to cause Essence Burst, making your next Disintegrate, Pyre, or Charge Blast cost no Essence. And Azure Essence Blast causes Azure Strike to have a 15% chance. The reason for the 5% difference is because Living Flame is cast, whereas Azure Essence is spammable. Spammable instant cast, so having slightly less of a chance to cause it is still pretty good. Now, underneath you have Arcane Instability. Your Disintegrate deals 10% more damage. You have Lay Waste. Deep Breath, damage is increased by 10%. And then you have Volatility, which is Pyre has a 30% chance to flare up and explode again on a nearby target. Now, you're likely to see a situation where you do this. Now, if you're playing the Fire build, you will have it set up like this. Now, Fire build, red team. Alternatively, if you're thinking that you're likely to play blue side, you might decide to do this instead, because Disintegrate over Deep Breath, potentially. Or, depending on the damage of Pyre and how likely you are to use it, you may decide that you don't want Volatility and Deep Breath is actually good. But let's go with the assumption that we're going to be playing a fire build first, and then we will probably play around and see what a blue build might look like at the end. You'll then want the maybe the essence cost reduced by 1, so that you can go further to the left here. But one ability that you will definitely want to pick up is Essence Burst. Can stack up to 2 times through Essence Attunement. This means that you have the ability to stack 2 of these bursts up, so you essentially, just so you don't accidentally waste one as you go through your rotation. So having that extra redundancy is probably a good shout. Now, Dragon Rage is a major cooldown. It's a 2-minute cooldown, erupted with Draconic Fury, and exhales 3 pyres at 3 enemies within 25 yards. For 14 seconds, Essence Burst's chance to occur is increased by 100%. And if you take the Ruin talent, you gain maximum benefit of your mastery. Now, interestingly enough, the Devastation Tree's mastery, called Giant Killer, means that you do more damage the more health a target has. It's actually the inverse of Execute. So if you think of Careful Aim for marksman hunters, doing increased damage the more health a target has. This does mean that for raid situations and for a lot of content, you're likely to not really care about your mastery. However, Dragon Rage allows you to fully make use of your mastery during this cooldown window, and by increasing Essence Burst's chance to occur by 100%, it does mean that spamming Azure Strike and having Essence Attunement is probably going to be a rather powerful combination. Now, for the left side, this is where you start diversifying whether you're going red or blue. Now, because you have Azure Affinity, where your blue spells deal 5% more damage, or you have Ruby Affinity, where your red spells deal 5% more damage and healing. So, focusing on the red side to start, this then opens up. You're going to take Animosity, put my teeth back in, because then that just increases the duration of Dragon Rage, so it lasts 20 seconds rather than 14. But then you have Imminent Destruction. Empowered spells reach a maximum level 20% less time. This shortens the charge time for your Empower spells, something you're probably going to pick up. This then imposes the question of taking the reduced cooldown on Imposing Presence, because remember, Quell is a 40-second baseline kick, and with Imposing Presence, you can reduce that to a 20-second cooldown. Then you have Font of Magic, which your Empower spells maximum level is increased by 1. This then is that, are you going to charge it to level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4? And level 4 obviously results in more damage. You also have a choice node here called Engulfing Blaze or Ruby Embers. Engulfing Blaze, Living Flame deals 40% increased damage and healing, but its cast time is increased. Or Ruby Embers, where your Living Flame deals damage over 12 seconds to enemies or restores health to allies over 12 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. This basically allows you to turn Living Flame into a dot, or have a dot component, which can be stacked. This probably means that paired with Ruby Essence Burst, you might start seeing a build where you're casting 3 Ruby Essences, your Living Flames on a target to apply the dot, and then you just maintain the dot, depending on obviously whether this dot pandemics and refreshes it or not. Because if it does, then you can keep a dot while then maintaining your burst stacks and whatever else via potentially Azure Strike. Cascading Power. Essence Burst has a 10% chance not to be consumed. Or Firestorm. Firestorm is another 20-second cooldown, 2-second cast, but an explosion bombards the target area with white hot cinders, dealing damage to enemies over 12 seconds. Either of these two are likely to be chosen, and obviously to progress, because we need to spend 3 points we'll take both, and then we take 1 point in Power Swell, sorry. Power Swell. Empower spells increase your essence regeneration rate by 50%, lasts 2 seconds per empower level. This means that you're going to end up in a situation where during Dragon Rage at least, you physically, like every other spell likely, is going to be a essence spender of some sort, because you're essence bursting and you're just going to have so many abilities to just spam out during Dragon Rage. Power Nexus increases the maximum essence to 6, so 5 rather than 6. Just means that you can get more spenders out, especially if you're playing around with things. But focusing over on the red side, Snapfire. Living Flame has a 12% chance to reset the cooldown of Firestorm and make your next one instant cast and deal 40% more damage. So your base fire filler, where you're applying a dot to the target, has a chance to reset Firestorm. Feed the Flames. Pyre reduces the remaining cooldown of Fire Breath by 2 seconds. And Pyre is likely to be one of your main essence. It is likely to be your essence spender if you are focusing on the red tree. So having this synergistic, every time I spend essence on Pyre, it reduces the cooldown on things, is fantastic. Fire Breath deals 20% more damage over time. Fire Breath reduces the cast of Living Flame by 30% for 4 seconds. That is huge, because what that could potentially mean is rather than using Ruby Embers, you could have Engulfing Blaze, so it deals more damage but its cast time's increased, but because you're using Fire Breath, that doesn't necessarily matter in the long haul. Ever-Burning Flame. Damaging an enemy with Pyre or Living Flame extends the duration of your Fire Breath's damage over time by 1 second. And then you have Ruin. Using Deep Breath and Dragon Rage, you gain the maximum benefit of your mastery regardless of the target's health. This does mean that regardless of which of these two builds, whether you're red or blue, you are going to be using Ruin. And then Tyranny is Fire Breath and Eternity Surge, reduce the remaining cooldown on Deep Breath and Dragon Rage by 1 second per empower level. This just further is cooldown reduction for an ability that is likely to be our main spender. Whether this, or main damage cooldown, I guess, because it depends on whether or not through this combination, are we going to be in a position where we can have the Dragon Rage's cooldown reduced from a 2-minute cooldown to a 1-minute cooldown. It might not necessarily be that drastic early on. It might only be reduced to, say, 90 seconds. But towards the end of the expansion, as haste levels increase and we get more accustomed to our build and things like that, there is every possibility, which means that there could be some interesting lineups with trinkets going forward. Now, you can see that playing around with the points, I had one available to me, and you'd have a choice between either putting it in something like Power Nexus, which increases your maximum essence, or Ever-Burning Flame. Damaging an enemy with Pyre or Living Flame extends the duration of your Fire Breath's damage over time. Now, this red build is probably going to very much be a focus on large AoE packs and maintaining dots and rolling through a spec. Now, for maybe solo play or for some Mythic Plus situations, like maybe a Fortified week, this might be really good depending on tuning. If, however, we break it down and look at the blue side, so we've taken Azure Affinity, we've swapped things back, we've still got our Power Swell, remove Nexus for a moment. Let's have a look at Eternity Surge. This is a channeled spell. It's an Empower, a bit like a Fire Breath. And as you can see, it damages different enemies based on how long you hold it for. So if you have it to 1 charge, it damages 1 enemy or 2 enemies. If you use Eternity Span, which is where is it? Ah, it's here. So it's further down. But it's baseline, it's one enemy, one charge, 2 enemies, and then 3 enemies if you use a baseline. And then obviously if you choose to increase its level, it can either damage 8 or 4 enemies. So we take that, pick that up, and then we've got Charge Blast, which is a 2 essence spender. Probably going to be one of the spenders that replace Pyre, because Pyre is primarily a red focus. Pick that up. You've then got, as a result of using Eternity Surge, you have essence abilities further reduce the cooldown of Eternity Surge, or Eternity Surge critical strikes grant you Essence Burst. Now, obviously we don't know how frequently we're going to get Essence Bursts, but there's every possibility that having high crit would benefit, because it means you can use more Charge Blasts and things like that. Because Azure Strike, for Charge Blast, for instance, Azure Strike increases the damage of Charge Blast by 100% for 3 seconds, stacking up to 2 times if you use Expansive Maw. Now, what's Expansive Maw? I hear you ask. Let's just pick Imminent Destruction. And we'll pick Font of Magic as well for this. Azure Strike's damage is increased by 15%. Honed Aggression, that's just a must take, especially when you consider that with Protracted Talons and Essence Burst, Azure Essence Burst, you're likely to be spending a lot of time just casting Azure Strike as your filler while you wait for your Essence to recharge. Eternity Span. Eternity Surge hits twice as many targets. Modified jump targets plus 100% for Azure Strike. That just allows you to cleave more targets, essentially. And following up from Charge Blast, you have a choice between Expansive Maw, Charge Blast deals 10% more damage and strikes 2 additional targets, or Arcane Reverberation, where Charge Blast has a 40% chance to instantly reset its own cooldown. Which is rather interesting, because Charge Blast has a 2-second essence cost, but a 15-second cooldown as well. Now, likely, I suspect Expansive Maw might be the choice, because it deals 10% more damage and strikes 2 more additional targets. Now, obviously we said that we wanted a blue build, sorry, so I forgot to take Disintegrate, because remember, Disintegrate is a blue spell. Continuum, Causality, yeah, I think Causality probably. Let's get this back up to where it should be. Expansive Maw. Right, so Ruin and Tyranny, because obviously we want to amplify Dragon Rage. And then Focusing Iris, Disintegrate increases the damage done to the target by 5% for 4 seconds. We're going to want 2 of them. And then Scintillation. Disintegrate has a 6% chance each time it deals damage to cast a level 1 Eternity Surge at your target. And this just as a pure salvo of damage that if you're using Eternity Span, damages 2 enemies. So it will cleave, almost like an arcane barrage, essentially. So you take Scintillation, and your blue build is probably going to look something like this. Because you're focusing at this point on this quadrant of the talent tree, and the red is obviously this bottom left quadrant with some crossover in the middle for things like your Dragon Rage talents. All in all, the Devastation tree itself seems to, or it seems like it will dictate which filler spell you use. If you're going down the red team, you'll be spending a lot of time rather static, casting Living Flame, maybe relying on hover during mobility situations. But if you're playing blue team, you're going to be a lot more mobile because of how Azure Strike works, and Azure Strike will become your dominant filler. There may still be elements where you will cast your Ruby or your Living Flame, but if you were to have this particular build, like blue team for instance, just quickly looking back across to the class tree, you might pick up Unravel is likely to do more damage because it's blue, we're going to want to get rid of that. Pick up that, pick up that, pick up that. Because if you're picking blue, essentially you have no reason to pick up Living Flame, because you're not likely to be picking it a lot. You could still hypothetically take it, but realistically, I suspect you're just likely to spend time with your Azure Strikes. Alternatively, if you're playing the red build, then you're probably not going to want to take Protracted Talons, because Azure striking an additional target isn't necessarily as impactful if you have other abilities where your Fire Breath, for instance, causes your next Living Flame to strike one additional target per empower level. And then your Fire Breath is further augmented and has the cooldown reduced by using Pyre. So you're getting your cast cleaves anyway through a different route. So, bringing it all back together then, the Devastation Evoker especially is very much aesthetic choice at the moment, because obviously damage numbers and tuning are still to be decided, but it appears thematically at least that red is going to be your demo man, your explosives, your large group damage in terms of TF2, whereas your blue is going to be more your single target, your sniper, your, you know, I'm going to do a lot of damage to this one thing with a little bit of cleave, but this is my focus. And hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. I appreciate it's been a long one, but talent discussions tended to be. Obviously, I did try condensing this down a lot, but do comment in below. Are you red or blue? I think if I'm going to play one, I'm likely to play red, purely because I'm a bit of a pyromaniac, honestly. And it'll be good fun. But in the meantime, I will catch you in the next video, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.